just want to take one step back and make one comment. So when assessing whether or not we might want to think of a country as vulnerable to import-related shocks, I think it makes sense to think jointly about answers to each of these questions. So, for example, being highly reliant on imports and being highly undiversified and sourcing all your food from a couple of key trading partners might be especially problematic. So with this as a background, let us proceed to the first question of this framework. So how important are imports for a country's food security? And the intuition here, and this is a little bit in a regional context, the intuition here is, in the context of import-related vulnerabilities, is that being more reliant on sourcing food commodities from global markets would render a country more exposed to either global price swings or trading partner or even trade route specific shocks. And so to answer this question, I want to introduce just one indicator called the import dependency ratio, which tells us the share of the total domestic availability of food or specific commodities that is made available for imports. So for example, considering Egypt on this slide, as indicated by the blue bars, roughly 40% of all calories that are available domestically are sourced through imports, on average. And of course, we can also consider this indicator for wheat, which is seen here in the slightly lighter bars. And so, for example, for Egypt, roughly 50% of overall domestic availability is made available through the import channel. So in terms of key messages that I think we should take away from this graph, I think there are two. So first, all countries in the wider Near East and North Africa region are net importers of food, including for wheat, or especially for wheat. And the second, and I think that's a related message, is that being a net importer of food commodities is not really unusual. So for example, Netherlands, as a country we would think of as highly food secure, included here as a global point of comparison, is also a net importer of foodstuffs, including wheat. And so, turning to the second question of this framework, being a net importer of food therefore doesn't necessarily mean that a country is vulnerable to import-related shocks. So for example, if a country sources commodities from a very wide range of different countries, shocks affecting exports or supplies from one individual supplier may not be very problematic. So this leads us directly to the second question of this talk. If a country depends on imports for domestic availability, such as Egypt, how diversified are global relationships? And this is something we explore on this graph. So on the y-axis, you see exactly the same information as presented before. That's the aggregate import dependency. So higher values mean more dependent on imports for local availability of food. On the x-axis, we now complement this information with an indicator that tells us how diversified the country's sourcing relationships are. So higher values, more to the right, means less diversified. And last, and just as a complementary sort of like information, the size of the circle is proportional to the share of the country's population that has been estimated to be undernourished by the FAO, WHO, IFAD, WFP, and co-office. So combining all of this information into one, countries that have bigger circle sizes and are more to the right upper corner of this graph could be considered as more exposed to shocks in supplier countries that affect their participation in export markets. So, and with respect to Egypt, the key message here is that the country is actually not too import dependent in regional comparison, but it does have a prevalence of undernourishment in the population of around 5%, and it has relatively undiversified import relationships for food commodities. And this would suggest that if a shock was to happen in one of the country's key suppliers, that this could potentially pose serious challenges for food supplies. For example, if the country has to readjust supply chains. Considering wheat in particular, on this side we see the degree to which wheat imports are diversified across two different countries, which is Morocco and Egypt. And both of these countries have two things in common. One is wheat contributes very sizably to total dietary intake, and imports play a very large role in making wheat available. And so on the top graph, we see the share of individual supplier countries in Morocco's total wheat imports in 2021. And in that year, the top three suppliers accounted for circa 65% of total wheat grain imports. But there were also a number of active trading relationships, open sources of imports, so to speak, from additional source countries. The bottom figure shows the same information for Egypt. Here, the top three suppliers accounted for more than 90% of total wheat imports in 2021, and there were far less trading relationships with other countries. And I think this very nicely mirrors what the previous speaker had to say about this topic. There's one important point that I want to make here which is about trade-offs or the cost of diversification. And so specifically, wheat from some origins such as France and Canada, which were Morocco's two key suppliers in 2021. So France and Canada account for, I think, something like 50% of total wheat imports. Wheat from these two core origins is usually more expensive than wheat originating from Ukraine or the Russian Federation. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that while Morocco does show more diversified import source and relationships for wheat, this might also come at a cost, at a monetary cost. Turning to the third component of this presentation, in the context of import-related vulnerabilities of food security in particular, we might also want to ask the following question: how stable, in the long run, are the supplies from a country's trading partners? And so the rationale here is that being a sizable net importer of food commodities and sourcing only from very few suppliers may also not necessarily be an issue. For example, if we have evidence that the countries that supply to us have been very consistent in participation in global food markets in the past. And that in turn may lead us to infer something about the future participation that could be shaped by countries' tendencies to, for example, impose export restricting measures, as was happened to a certain degree during COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine, on the frequency and severity of weather-related shocks production. So this is the last content slide that I have. So in this slide, we see the contribution of individual suppliers to Egypt's total wheat imports in 2021. But now together with an additional piece of information presented on the right of this graph in dots that indicates how variable exports from individual supplier countries of wheat have been over the past 25 years, and higher values even more variability. So for example, India, the country that actually accounted for a sizable 4% of global wheat trade in 2021, in the past has sometimes not exported much, and in some years sizable quantities. So the key insight here, I just wanted to flag before I go to my conclusions, is that Egypt's top suppliers of wheat in 2021 have already in the past shown at least somewhat less stable participation in global export markets for wheat, and have been less stable than, for example, key suppliers of the same commodities such as France or Canada, which, as I just mentioned, make up most of Morocco's imports. So last, I want to close with just two ideas on how to potentially reduce import-related vulnerabilities in Egypt with a focus on wheat. Apologies. The first one is to consider a review of government tender procedures and specifications for imported wheat, as well as options to leverage private sector participation in importing activities. And this is based on the fact that in many countries in the region, and of course also in Egypt, governments themselves obviously are very actively involved in purchasing grains and wheat internationally. So for example, as shown in this graph, this is for 2021. In this year, the General Authority for Supply Commodities accounted for around 40.5% of the country's total wheat imports through its tender program. And I believe in 2022, while the volumes went down, the share that the task held actually went up to something like 47%, if I'm not mistaken. And so I think one distinct opportunity to reduce the cost of imported food and food security-related vulnerabilities could be to leverage the existence of one big importing entity and to think a little bit about a review of the specifications put forward in such public tenders. For example, with respect to quality, delivery terms, or protein content requirements of imported wheat, or maybe also eligible origin countries. And in a similar vein, I think exploring options to further leverage private sector participation may also help in reducing risks, among others, by getting more agents involved into importing wheat and other commodities. The second idea, and I'll stop in just a moment, is, and I think this is certainly more of a medium to long run consideration, is that promoting more diversified diets, so like, for example, through reviewing existing subsidy programs, could not only be beneficial for diet-related health outcomes, but it may also help in reducing import-related vulnerabilities by decreasing the reliance on one particular commodity, which is wheat, with its very own and distinct global production method. Thank you very much.